During the time that John Marshall was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, there was a raft of landmark decisions setting precedent of what the Constitution meant. Additionally, during the time that Andrew Jackson was president, there were several important decisions dealing with the relations between the states and Native Americans and between the national government and Native Americans. One of the cases dealing with relationship between the state or the federal government and Native Americans was Worcester versus Georgia. Worcester was an American citizen who had violated a state law, a Georgia law, that made it illegal for individuals to do business on tribal property. Thus, he was arrested and jailed. Worcester sued for his freedom, and the case eventually went all the way to the Supreme Court. In the decision in Worcester versus Georgia, the Supreme Court ordered that Worcester had to be released because the federal government was the only level of government that had the right to deal with Indian nations. Thus, Justice Marshall and the Supreme Court ruled that states had no authority in Indian affairs. Thus, they could not pass statutes, they could not pass laws affecting the actions of citizens in Indian nations or Indian territories. It is important to remember that neither the Cherokee Nation nor the national government were party to this suit. The results of the case were viewed differently, dependent upon one's perhaps beliefs on how Native Americans should be treated and what the Constitution meant. Associate Justice of the Supreme Court Joseph Story was quoted as saying, "Thanks be to God, the court can wash their hands clean of the inequity of oppressing the Indians and disregarding their rights." Thus, Story believed that Worcester versus Georgia would usher in a new set of relationships between the states and the Native American nations. And Story believed that the federal government in the form of the Supreme Court would be the protector of the Native Americans, protecting Native Americans against oppressive actions of state governments. Although some agreed with Story's interpretation of the case, that is, that it would stop the involuntary removal of Native Americans, that it would give Native American nations more sovereignty, that even perhaps it would put the federal government in the position of protecting Native Americans. The case did not stop the removal of Native Americans from their tribal lands, that movement that had been provided for in the Indian Removal Act. Neither did the decision in any way stop the events that would eventually become known as the Trail of Tears. Although the legislative branch interprets the laws, one has to remember that it's the job of the executive branch to enforce them, and President Jackson was not of a great mind to enforce Worcester versus Georgia, at least not in the way that Justice Story had interpreted the meaning of it. As Jackson wrote in a letter to a friend, the decision of the Supreme Court, referencing Worcester versus Georgia, has fell stillborn, and they find that they cannot coerce Georgia to yield its mandate. That is, Jackson said, there's no power in this. It's ineffective upon arrival. This is not going to stop Georgia or any other state from acting upon the Native Americans, the Native American nations, and the inhabitants of Native American lands. Or, as legend has it, Jackson didn't actually say these words, but as legend has it, this is Mr. Marshall's decision, let him enforce it. Additionally, in Jackson's second annual message to Congress, his general feelings about Native Americans in general are very clear. He said, "Humanity has often wept over the fate of the aborigines of this country, and philanthropy has long been busily employed in devising means to avert it. But its progress has never for a moment been arrested, and one by one have many powerful tribes disappeared from the earth." But true philanthropy reconciles the mind to these vicissitudes as it does to the extinction of one generation to make room for another. Philanthropy could not wish to see this continent restored to the condition in which it was found by our forefathers. What good man would prefer a country covered with forests, ranged by a few thousand savages, to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, embellished with all the improvements which art can devise or industry can execute? occupied by more than 12 million happy people, and filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion. President Jackson certainly has to stand responsible in history for his actions toward the Native Americans, for his refusal to stop what becomes known as the Trail of Tears. But it's reasonable to remember that Jackson's a backwoodsman, a Southernman, a Westerner, that his views as a Southerner and a Westerner towards Native Americans were not significantly out of line with those of many Southerners and Westerners. That is certainly not to condone the views, but we must at least recognize the context in which Jackson created these views, in which his views were created.